Hello, and welcome to the Ethanol Producer Magazine podcast. This is Anna Simet. Hope you're doing well. Today, I'll be chatting with Erin Krueger, Senior News Editor at BBI International, and that includes of Ethanol Producer Magazine. Erin has been in her role for nearly 18 years, and she follows policy for us at BBI. And so today we're really going to be focusing on what's going on, what producers should be paying attention to, all as a precursor to the upcoming International Fuel Ethanol Workshop, the industry's must-attend event. And this year we're also co-located with the Sustainable Fuel Summit, Carbon Capture and Storage Summit, and Ethanol 101. So something for everyone. Erin, welcome to the podcast, and thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us today.
Absolutely. Happy to do it.
So, Erin, let's just jump right into things right now. What would you say is the single biggest thing ethanol producers should be paying attention to right now, policy-wise or whatever it be?
I think the biggest takeaway for ethanol producers right now is the industry is really in a good place. Economics are strong, export demand is amazing, policy is moving in the right direction. For policy in particular, things rarely move in a straight line. There's a lot of starts and a lot of stops, and it can certainly be frustrating. But it's important to remember that the congressional process is slow and inefficient by design. I think it's also important to mention that policy is never really settled. It's always an ongoing process. For example, I would consider the RFS a very stable energy policy. It was established by law in 2005 and was implemented in 2007. So we're at nearly 2 decades of where that policy has actively been in place. But even with that stability, the process to set annual blending obligations can be frustrating. And the strength of the RVOs is largely a function of political will and external economic factors. So some administrations are more aggressive with their approach to biofuels. High oil prices, like we're seeing right now with the war in Iran, also tend to boost support for renewable fuels. And then as far as the 45Z clean fuel production credit, that's also an example. That credit has actually been in place since 2025. But we've already seen some pretty big changes, some of those changes good and some less good. The elimination of indirect land use change from CI calculations was clearly a win for ethanol, but the elimination of the credit premium for SAF certainly changed the math on some of those proposed projects. So if you began developing a sustainable aviation fuel project in 2025 with the expectation that you could claim a 45Z credit of up to $1.50 per gallon, the decision Congress made to lower that cap to $1 per gallon will clearly have an impact on your project. And now we actually have some legislation introduced trying to reinstate that credit for the premium for sustainable aviation fuel. So I guess the point I'm trying to make is that ethanol producers and other industry stakeholders have to really continue to be engaged in policy development, even when it feels like things are moving in a positive direction. Policy is changing all the time, and you can't be complacent.
Right. Very well said, Erin. Thank you. So would you say you're seeing more clarity right now or more uncertainty?
It's definitely a mix of both, which is typical. As I already mentioned, the RFS itself is a very stable policy, and the finalization of the 2026 and 2027 RVOs means that we have very stable expectations for the next few years. I'd expect work on the 2028 RVOs to kick off sometime next year, so that process just constantly repeats itself. For 45Z, we have a really good idea of what the nuts and bolts of the tax credit will be, things like certification and registration requirements. I think the biggest piece of the puzzle that we're missing right now is certainty over how climate smart ag practices will factor into CI scores. And that process is very much ongoing. The USDA actually submitted a final rule containing technical guidelines for the production of regenerative agricultural biofuel feedstocks to the White House Office of Management and Budget earlier this month. And so I'd expect that rule to inform how different farm practices will affect CI scores moving forward. We also need to see the 45Z specific GREET model from the U.S. Department of Energy to be updated. So the comment period on the proposed 45Z regulations actually closed earlier this month. Typically, it takes a federal agency a month or two to make any necessary changes to that proposal, and then we can expect to see final regulations submitted back to the White House for interagency review once that process is complete. We also have a public hearing scheduled in late May. So, bottom line, we're highly unlikely to see anything concrete until the second half of the year, which will be disappointing to some producers, but that process just takes a long time.
That is for sure. Okay. Thanks, Erin. So let's talk a little bit more about SAF. What stands out about how ethanol is being positioned in SAF policy?
Ethanol certainly continues to be a part of the SAF conversation, but we're just not quite there yet. There are numerous ethanol to jet projects in various phases of development, both in the US and abroad, but we haven't really seen any of those projects producing at scale yet. The viability of a lot of these projects is going to hinge on how emissions are calculated, how the tax credits shake out, and what kind of premium airlines are going to be willing to pay for the resulting fuel. Technology development is also a factor. There's a lot of factors that have to come together to make this to work. That said, I'm not trying to be pessimistic, just realistic. And for me, a lot of what's going on with ethanol to jet mirrors what we saw with cellulosic ethanol 10 or 15 years ago. There's a lot of potential, but it's probably not an industry that's going to explode overnight. Developing new technology just takes time to scale.
Right. Okay. Would you say recent policy signals have shifted the outlook for ethanol to jet?
There's definitely continued interest and momentum, particularly as developers and producers look at long-term demand growth for SAF or SAF. Investment decisions, however, are often closely tied to policy certainty. Stakeholders want to know what the incentives will be and that they'll be durable and that the carbon accounting framework will support their projects. So the direction is encouraging, but we're still in a phase where clarity will really determine the pace of investment.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about the potential for ethanol to jet. What are some of the other market opportunities for ethanol right now?
E15 is the biggest one. Industry stakeholders continue to work very diligently to enable year-round E15 on a nationwide basis. And this has been an extremely long process. As many people remember, several years ago, the EPA tried to take action on E15, but the agency's regulation was ultimately overturned by the courts. So legislative action is really the only way we can achieve the necessary regulatory changes. And lawmakers have been working very, very hard for years to make that happen. And I think we're finally there. So there's been growing support in Congress for E15, and I think we have enough lawmakers willing to vote yes on E15 now. Now we just need to figure out a way to bring a bill to vote. So with the war in Iran, the fight over Homeland Security funding, numerous other hot button issues, lawmakers just haven't really been able to focus on E15. Still, I'm optimistic that we will see E15 legislation move forward sometime this year. And then I also want to make sure that I mention marine fuels. So we've talked a lot about ethanol to jet, but there's also a big push globally for cleaner marine fuels. So I think marine fuels offer a huge near-term opportunity to expand demand for ethanol. We haven't really seen much in terms of policy development related to renewable or clean marine fuels, at least in the US, but this is definitely a market to keep an eye on.
For sure. Exciting. Okay, so Erin, where are producers still looking for answers?
A big question right now is how all these policies translate into real project economics. Producers are asking what qualifies under these programs, what doesn't, how do we position our facilities or future investments to take advantage of these opportunities? There's also a lot of interest in how federal policy will interact with state level programs and whether those can stack in a meaningful way. Those are complex questions, and they're exactly the kind of topics that tend to come up in deeper discussions at the industry events like the Fuel Ethanol Workshop and Expo.
That's a great segue into my next question. So, why would you say this is a can't miss moment to attend the FEW?
The timing is especially important this year because we're at a point where policy is actively taking shape, but it's not fully locked in. That creates a real opportunity for producers, developers, and stakeholders to better understand where things are headed and to hear directly from the people shaping those conversations. Events like the International Fuel Ethanol Workshop and Expo bring together policy experts, technology providers, and producers all in one place, which makes it a lot easier to connect the dots. If you're trying to make informed decisions in a challenging landscape, this is exactly the kind of environment where that happens, especially while early bird registration is still available.
I agree. And Erin, that's the end of my questions. I just wanted to thank you so much for sharing your insight with us. It's much appreciated, and I'm sure our listeners think so too.
Thanks. It was a pleasure speaking with you.
Absolutely. And to our listeners, the early bird rate expires at the end of the day, April 22nd. That is $200 off normal registration rates. Ethanol producers get in free. Learn more or register at ethanolconference.com. That'll do it for this one. Catch you next time.